Welcome everyone and to this EWB Talks, part of our Sustainable Engineering Week. I'm Karin Balfarban, Head of Communications at EWB Sweden. And today we have with us here Axel Eriksson, who's going to talk today about his engagement for environmental justice. And we have Caroline Edelstam, Secretary General of EWB Sweden. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. It's our great pleasure to invite you to our Sustainable Engineering Week. And we're happy to see so many in this little conference we have here today. I would like to welcome Axel Eriksson, who is a student from Lund and an advocate for environmental justice, who has been participated in the 3 UN summits on biodiversity, climate and land, and will now discuss and report a little bit on, they also treated biodiversity, climate change and the desertification. So Axel, I leave the floor to you to tell you a little bit about yourself then. Thank you.
First of all, thanks for inviting me. So as Caroline said, I've been studying engineering physics at Lund University since 2020, I believe, and have in parallel engaged quite a bit in civil society. So most recently, I was youth delegate for Sweden in the UN Climate Convention and UN Biodiversity Conventions until last year, it becomes the year before that now. Right now, I'm working as the training manager for the Climate Youth Negotiators Programme. So trying to help build the capacities of young people from across the world to represent their countries in the UN Climate Convention. And as Caroline said, during last fall, there were 3 major UN summits on the environment. There were many more, but these were the 3 ones that I was most engaged in, on biodiversity, climate, and land. The so-called 3 Rio conventions, which are basically 3 major environmental conventions that were founded in 1992 and that are meeting either each year or every second year to make new decisions on how countries from across the world should tackle the environmental crisis. So this is a bit briefly about me, and my general engagement in this comes from the fact that the environmental crisis are affecting already vulnerable populations and ecosystems disproportionately, and thus I want to use the knowledge and the resources that I have in my network to help as much as possible.
Thank you, Axel. So I thought we could just start off a little bit. I know those UN summits often receive a criticism that they have too low ambition and that they are dominated by vested interests. What purpose do you think they serve, and what difference do they make for people and the planet?
Yes, I mean I know where the criticism comes from. So, for example, at the last climate summit, there were over 1,700 lobbyists for the fossil fuel industry, if I remember the number correctly. And the year before that, there were even more. And this is highly problematic, considering that fossil fuels are one of the main drivers of the climate crisis, or it is the main driver because of its high emissions. And it has also been the fact that often there are disproportionate sizes of delegations for the countries that have resources and are the most responsible historically for the climate crisis. So the most vulnerable countries often have 1, 2, or maybe 3 delegates in their entire delegation present at these climate conferences, whereas countries like in the European Union or in the US might have hundreds of delegates, which also creates a big power imbalance. So I do recognize that there is ground for the criticism that these conferences are dominated by certain interests, and that the voices of those who are most affected have quite low conditions to be heard. However, I think one important purpose with having these meetings is that they serve as a meeting place. Basically, this is one of the only fora that countries from across the world are meeting with, on paper, the same say in the decisions made, and where they can express basically what are their needs in terms of combating these triple crisis of climate, biodiversity loss, and land degradation. So it does serve as a platform for countries to meet, but not only for countries to meet, it also serves as a platform for other actors to meet, whether it's businesses, whether it's civil society, youth organizations, indigenous communities. It can serve as a global platform to ensure that we're not only tackling this crisis on the national level, but actually together on the global level, whether it's the government or any other actor. And another reason why these are important is that they set a common baseline. So the decisions that come out of these conferences, yes, they are not matching what the large part of science is telling would be needed to meet the targets that have been set out. So for example, in the Paris Agreement, there's a target of, or a goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, at most 2 degrees Celsius. And the current commitments of countries are leaning towards around 3 degrees of warming, depending on which scenario we follow. And it is clear that the commitments that have been made are not enough. But at least these international conferences set a baseline for the action to be taken. So without these conferences, the predictions might be even worse. And finally, one reason why these conferences are important is that they serve as a place where countries are again and again asked to recommit that they will take environmental action, so that it's not possible to commit to something 1 year and then it gets forgotten. Actually, there's a reminder every year or every second year that this is still important. And civil society is present, media is present. There are many actors that are present to hold decision makers accountable in these spaces. And thus, it is a way to raise accountability.
Yeah, it's really an important reminder, and as you say, commitment to the climate change, and to continue to talk about the problems, of course. Could you tell us a little bit what were the main points of discussion and the outcomes across all three of those summits?
Yes, so I can start with the more negotiated outcomes, basically the outcomes that are in the decision texts of these conferences, and I would explain a bit more how this works. So the way these UN summits work is that countries come with their delegations, basically a group of representatives of that country, and each country has a voice in the decision making. So each country has to agree to decisions being made from these conferences, which is called consensus. Basically, it's not a vote, it's full agreement. So if one country objects, then the decision does not go through. That's how it works in the biodiversity and climate conventions mainly. I haven't looked into the processes of the land convention, that's why I don't know. But for the biodiversity and climate one, that's how it works. And to make sure that each country is able to follow, all the different topics that are discussed, because there are, in some cases, 20 to 30 different agenda points. They don't negotiate on their own behalf. They are often part of larger coalitions. So, for example, the countries in the EU, like Sweden, are negotiating as the EU. So they have one common position that they're working to get into decisions. And then there's a group of African negotiators, one group of, for example, there's the Arab group and many other negotiating groups who somehow have similar interests that they want to get into the final decisions. With this being said, one of the main difficulties in all of the three different COPs last fall is the issue of financing. So often it's being discussed how should countries who often have historical responsibility for causing these crises finance the efforts of the countries that are most vulnerable and who have not caused the crisis to a large extent. How should the resource-rich countries finance those efforts? And this is usually a very contentious topic. So the group of so-called developing countries, which includes the majority of the countries in the world, as that group is defined under the conventions, advocated for having about 1.3 trillion US dollars of climate finance every year from 2035 onwards, at least. This was met by a much lower commitment from the group of developed countries. And this means that there was quite a large gap to be bridged in terms of financing. It was a similar context for the biodiversity negotiations, where there was supposed to be a decision on finance for biodiversity actions, but it was postponed. So when the biodiversity conference happened in October, it was delayed, and since there were not enough country representatives present anymore, the whole conference had to be postponed until February. So there are still some decisions on biodiversity that are waiting to happen in February. And there were also quite a few commitments in terms of financing for the land. The land convention. However, as I said, since this is such a contentious topic, often the needs estimate of financing is much higher than the actual commitments made. So there's quite a big gap to be bridged there. So that was a common issue across all the three COPs. But for specifically the biodiversity COP, there was a quite major decision on recognizing the knowledge and contributions of indigenous peoples and local communities. So there was a new body within that convention, which was created which has this role to represent indigenous peoples and local communities. And this is a major step. This is the first time in the UN Biodiversity Convention or any of the Rio Convention that there is such a dedicated body on such a high level to really integrate traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples and many other aspects. And then for the Climate Convention, aside from the big financing issue that I told you about, there is also was also an issue about trading carbon credits, you could say. So market-based approaches to international cooperation on climate. And in this context, there have been discussions over 9 years. So since the Paris Agreement was made, it's been discussed how do we finalize this mechanism for international cooperation on market-based approaches. And finally, it was decided upon in this COP for climate last November. So this was also a major step, concluding 9 years of work. And then finally, for the land COP, there was a decision on more structurally including civil society and including young people in the processes, and also a more formal recognition of the so-called science policy interface, which is a body of scientists which provides input to the UN Land Convention to make sure that their inputs are more structurally integrated into the decision making of that convention. So those are a few of the major outcomes. But of course, as I said, there were many parallel agenda items for each of these conferences, and thus many different decisions.
And in this, I'm just thinking of those challenges you are mentioning. Which one would you consider to be the worst one? Is it the most difficult one? Is it the funding gap, or is it to find consensus? And
yeah, I think it's a bit hard to compare them because for the funding question, there's a very certain dynamic that it is one group of countries that have traditionally been the donors of financing, and thus they share a common position on that usually, and then another group of countries who have been the recipients, and then a group in between who have not been formally obligated to provide financing, but have in different respects provided either development financing, which has environmental objectives as well, or somehow contributed to this, and thus it is quite divided between groups in that particular question on funding or financing. Whereas for other issues, it's a bit less clear cut often. So there are issues on, for example, adaptation to climate change, where the positions differ even within these different groups I mentioned. So the broad group of so-called developed countries and of developing countries, within those groups there are quite different positions on what priority should be given to adaptation, for example, compared to mitigation. And adaptation is the efforts to adapt to climate change that will happen, whereas mitigation is reducing emissions or reducing the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So those are two different components that are often, let's say, discussed that they should be balanced between both mitigation and adaptation, but different countries have different views on exactly how to balance that, and that often leads to quite big discussions when it is, for example, the EU often speaks very strongly that we should put more focus on mitigation, and this is often met by some countries by the argument that the EU cannot force this upon the rest of the world. We need to make sure that we are adapting to the effects that are already happening, and we need to make sure that there is sufficient financing to be given before we can commit to any further actions on mitigation. So my brief summary is that it's quite complex to say what is difficult, because all of these issues are quite entangled in each other.
Yes, it's like a snake pit.
Yeah. I think a negotiator once called the financing of the UN Climate Convention as a pasta bowl or similar, or spaghetti bowl.
Yeah, yes, that's a very good, yes, thank you. And what would be the next steps now following up on the meetings?
Well, there are. I would say the most important thing is to implement the commitments on the ground in the countries. So for the Biodiversity Convention, there has been basically a call for countries to update their plans for how should they meet the goals and targets set under this Biodiversity Convention, and unfortunately these plans have been delayed in many cases. Because they were supposed to be ready by the COP last year, but not even half of the countries of the world had submitted them. So this is an ongoing effort to update those so-called national biodiversity strategies and action plan. And it is a similar issue for the Climate Convention, where there are similar plans that need to be updated until the next COP, to make sure that the commitments and the decisions made at the COPs are actually translated into action on the national level. So I would say that's the most important follow-up, because without implementation, these agreements won't lead to any difference. And another important follow-up is that most of these summits are basically, when we talk about these conventions, often it's the summits that get the media attention. However, there are many meetings in between where actually in practice most of the decisions are being made. So this is the case that there are so-called intersessional meetings, which are basically meetings of countries to make suggestions for the next COP. So basically, when the next COP starts, it doesn't start from an empty draft. It already has some draft decisions prepared. So this will be happening all throughout the next year. And what's worth noting is that the Climate Convention will be having another summit this year, in autumn 2025 in Brazil. It's called COP30. So we will soon see another summit there, but for the Biodiversity and Land Conventions, the next summits are happening in 2026. So it will take a bit more time, but still there will be meetings ongoing for those two as well during that time.
It's very interesting to learn more about this. You read about it in the newspapers, but how the mechanisms work and how the countries actually work to implement the outcomes. It's thank you for teaching us more about this. So in order to, we have about 5 minutes left here. I was wondering also, how do you think that engineers and engineering students actually can get involved in these UN conventions, and other people as well, of course?
Yeah, there are many ways. So the first way I would say is that you are already competent enough. There's already something you can contribute with. Basically, the implementation of these conventions and the decision making, every part of the process needs a wide diversity of actors. We need people who have technical expertise in terms of, is it actually feasible to make a decision to reduce the carbon emissions by a certain percentage. We need to have expertise in what are the actual financing needs to make sure that the countries defined as developing have the technical and financial resources they need, and also the capacity resources they need to, whether it's expand renewable energies or ensure that there is adaptation to sea level rise and many other issues. We need people with that kind of technical expertise, and I think as engineers and engineering students, we are quite well, let's say, suited to that. But by being in specific fields, whether it's civil engineering in terms of infrastructure, or whether it's energy engineering in terms of working on the energy grid and production. So I do think that expertise is quite needed. And for me, the way it started for me, I was, as I said, involved in civil society for quite a long while. And I basically just tried joining a few organizations that were involved in these conventions, and got the opportunity through one of them to go to my first COP. I did not really know anything about exactly what will happen there, exactly what might I be able to change there, but it was just taking an opportunity and trying to learn as I went. So I think it's quite important just to try out and then see if how you can best contribute as you learn. So that's something that helped me. And finally, I think as something that I've been helped with in my engineering education is basically problem solving. So trying to divide problems into smaller parts, trying to understand when we talk about mitigation, trying to decompose, why is it so hard for different countries to agree upon this? What are the actual root causes of the positions they're taking? So for example, when there's a specific amount of climate finance to be given, one of the main arguments of the donor countries is that we won't give money just to do it. We need to have guarantees that it's done in a transparent way, that it goes to the purposes that are intended. So this is a cost behind, which is not always seen in the positions taken. But if you try to decompose the problem a bit and try to understand the root causes, then you will soon see that there are reasons behind every position, and that even if you might not be able to see how to make a compromise on the positions that countries state from the beginning, that we want 1.3 trillion US dollars of financing, and we want 300 billion US dollars of financing per year. These are two entirely different positions. But if you actually go to the reasons behind it, then you can more easily find a compromise. And I think the problem-solving skills of engineers is quite helpful there.
So, with other words, then engineers play a crucial role in transforming and preserving our future, one could say.
Yes, I would say so, but I'm biased.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Axel, for this. It's really interesting to learn a bit more about it. I think now the time is 10:30, so we should move on to leave some questions here to the floor. I see we have received some questions in the chat. Yes. Okay.
We have from Matthew. During COP, does one speak about just energy transition?
The answer is yes. In particular, there's a whole work program on just transition within the UN Climate Convention, and that's in the other two conventions. I don't think I know for the biodiversity, they don't deal so much with energy transitions. It's mainly in the Climate Convention, and here it has both a global aspect and also let's say national aspect or intra-national aspect, that the energy transition should be globally just in the sense that all countries have equitable conditions to implement this energy transition, and also within countries, and both of these aspects are included in slightly different ways within the UN Climate Convention. So for example, in this Just Transition work program, there was quite a bit of discussion of how can trade measures enable this just transition, and what might be barriers when making that transition. So there was quite a bit of concern raised with the carbon border adjustment mechanism of the EU, which functions in the way that products which are imported from outside the EU, which have a higher carbon emission, also get higher tariffs when imported into the EU. And there was concern raised that this disproportionately affects countries in the global south. So this was not specific to energy necessarily, but it's about a just transition more broadly, that it is currently discussed. How can the policies implemented by different countries be just on the global level, and also on the national level? There are discussions about what let's say conditions to put in place to make sure that the populations that are highly dependent on energy sources that are currently considered as unsustainable, like fossil fuels, that they won't lose their access to energy in their transition, but actually that there can be simultaneous expansion of sustainable energies and also energy access for everyone. So those are a few different discussion threads which are still ongoing.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? Caroline, do you have any more questions up your sleeve?
Well, no, but we could just discuss a bit what's happening with the US now. How do you think their new politics are actually affecting our work with climate change and our sustainable development goals in regards to this?
Yeah, the quick answer is a lot, and the longer answer is that I mean the US is drawing out of the Paris Agreement according to the president's executive order, and this means that the world's second largest emitter would not be part of the Paris Agreement if this happens, and of course this creates some concerns that the decisions made under the COP or specifically on the Paris Agreement will not be binding for the world's second largest emitter. So that is a problem. However, at the same time, there is also the situation that many of the states within the US are to the same level of ambition as they were before, which means that much of the action that the US has already taken on climate will continue, hopefully. Whereas, of course, it's a negative trend that on the federal level of the US, that there is a change in policy which would have disastrous climate consequences. So that's the climate aspect of it. In terms of biodiversity and land, it was quite recently stated that the US Agency for International Development, USAID, would be closed down. I know that it's still a bit unsure exactly what will be the consequences, but there is a trend towards the direction of reducing its activities and pausing them for now. Since the US is such a big donor of financing across all the 3 different conventions, this is of course concerning that this financing might not be continued, which means that many of the projects in countries that need them, or in communities within countries that need them, will be left without the resources to properly implement them. So I see it as mainly concerning, and yeah, I would follow the development.
Yeah, I think we will all follow the development. No, it's it's very sad to hear about this, to be honest. I don't know if we have any more questions from the floor. No, you have anything more you want to add before we wrap up the session?
What I would like to say is that now I have touched quite a bit on the negative, the challenging aspects of these COPs, which of course is important. I would also want to bring in a few elements of hope that there are positive trends. And for example, I am currently working with the Climate Youth Negotiators Programme, which is administered by the Youth Negotiators Academy, and we are training young people to negotiate on behalf of their countries in the UN Climate Convention, and we also have a program in the UN Land Convention. This means that we are equipping young people with skills to represent their countries, and more than that, what we're trying to do is to help create a culture of care within this quite geopolitically dominated process of COPs, to basically ensure that rather than trying to further divide countries along traditional lines of positions, try to create more understanding, create common solutions, trying to make sure that we can actually, as negotiators of different countries which have had different views, come from very different situations, can actually collaborate on solutions rather than compete. So I think those kinds of initiatives of just trying to reform the dynamics of power within these conventions are quite important. Although recognizing that right now, as we said in the beginning, there are large interests that don't want to promote climate actions that have influenced specifically the climate COP, and we're seeing some similar trends for at least the biodiversity one. But I do think we should not forget the positive initiatives of civil society actors, indigenous peoples, local communities, and others who really try to lead change either on the global level in these kinds of COPs, even though it's hard, or in their local situations with restoration projects on the ground, or with policy making to try to make a city carbon neutral by 2040. There are many actions that are taken on the ground which are not really reflected in the media coverage of these different COPs. So I think that's very important, and I personally see quite a big reason for hope. And why I see a hope is that I do think that the situation would be much worse if there weren't many ambitious people who really care about the environment, care about other human beings, who want to promote action. And I think the one person that has inspired me quite a bit is the former climate chief of the UN, Christiana Figueres, who coined the term of stubborn optimism. Basically recognizing that, of course, we should be outraged at all the negative developments that are happening, but at the same time, in that difficult situation, we should be optimistic that we can make it better by acting. We can save lives by acting, which would otherwise not be saved. So I do think what we do matters. I think that's my main key message, that every action matters.
I'm grateful for those last words, because it gives us a bit of a hope, as you say, and it is impressive with all the initiatives from climate fighters and environmental defenders and engineers and many other people around the globe. So it's good you leave us on this positive note, Axel. So thank you so much all for being here this week at this seminar, and also thank you, Axel, for a very good report from the COPs. I would also like to just mention that we have several other seminars this week which are online and which you can find on the link Karin has posted in the chat. And yes, thank you all of you for taking your time to be here with us today.
Big thanks.
Thank you so much. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Yes, and we all congratulate Axel for his great engagement.
Yes.
Thank you.
Honored.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.